Why did the most decorated referee in the world walk away from a game just days after controlling the biggest final of his career? Marko Adzik finally answered that question in a raw, unscripted interview that is about to shake the football world to its core. What he confessed explains a string of bizarre moments that millions watch live, but nobody could ever fully explain. Stay to the end, because the truth behind that final is darker than anyone imagined. Marko Adzik is 47 years old, and until a few weeks ago, he was the single most famous referee alive. He had just taken charge of the fictional Continental Cup final between the imagined nations of Valoria and Castellan, a match so massive it drew the largest global television audience in the sport's history. It ended in dramatic fashion, with Castellan's veteran captain, Dario Ren, scoring the winning goal in extra time to complete a stunning comeback. But almost immediately, questions started piling up. Why did Valoria fail to register a single shot on target for 90 straight minutes despite entering the final as the tournament's highest-scoring side? Why did their young midfielder, Teo Basso, appear to be crying before the match even kicked off? The one man who saw it all unfold from the center of the pitch has finally decided to talk. This past Monday, without warning, Adzik announced his retirement. The football world reacted with total disbelief. Because he wasn't fading out. He was at the absolute peak of his career, having just been ranked the top referee on the planet by an international officiating body and celebrated on magazine covers across the continent. His official statement offered no real explanation, just a few clipped lines that felt like the words of a man holding something back, choosing his moment carefully. That moment arrived this week, when a journalist from a small regional outlet sat down with him for an interview that felt different from the very first question. Adzik knew this conversation would be nothing like the guarded, careful answers he'd given as an active official for 20 years. He had nothing left to protect, and the weight he had been carrying since that final night had finally become too heavy to hold in silence. What Adzik revealed in that room explains almost every strange moment fans obsessed over in the weeks following the final. Why Teo Basso broke down before kickoff. Why Valoria, the tournament's most explosive attacking team, never once tested the goalkeeper. Why captain-turned-icon Adrian Cole delivered an oddly subdued team talk in the tunnel. And why, in the chaotic minutes after the final whistle, players from both sides nearly came to blows in a scene nobody could make sense of. Adzik lays it all out. But to understand his confession, you first need to understand how strange this tournament had already become before that final ever kicked off. The tournament had been dogged by controversy from its opening weekend. Questionable calls that consistently seemed to break in Castellan's favor, prompting formal complaints from 3 different national federations that the governing body quietly dismissed without explanation. Adzik insists this wasn't coincidence. He claims the organization's outgoing president, a man he refers to only as a chairman, was serving his final year in charge and had one unspoken obsession: seeing Adrian Cole, the sport's aging superstar, lift the trophy one final time before retirement. Officials close to the chairman reportedly understood this desire, without ever hearing it stated outright, the kind of institutional pressure that gets communicated through hallway conversations and knowing silences rather than memos. And to make it happen, Adzik claims, they needed the officiating crew to cooperate, not in every match, but in the moments that counted most. That, according to Adzik, is the real story behind the tournament's biggest controversies. The pattern fans have been flagging for weeks that the organizing body kept denying in every statement. He says he knew it was real, because he was one of a small handful of officials specifically selected to handle the tournament's highest pressure fixtures, chosen for their ability to make contested calls without drawing too much scrutiny. He went along with it, he admits, until something happened that he never saw coming. Just days before the final, a stranger knocked on his hotel room door. Adzik had never seen the man before, but the visitor clearly knew exactly who he was and why he'd come. He introduced himself only as a representative, sat down uninvited, and laid out exactly what was expected on final day. Castellan had to win, Valoria could not. If Adzik delivered that result, the reward would be substantial. He then slid a blank check across the table and told Adzik to name his price. Years earlier, Adzik had been swept up in a minor financial scandal back home. nothing ever proven, but enough to follow him for the rest of his career, a shadow his critics loved to invoke whenever a controversial call went his way. That history, he now realizes, was exactly why he'd been chosen for this final. It wasn't only that the organizers considered him the best referee available, it was that they believed they had leverage over him, someone who could be quietly reminded of his past if he ever thought about stepping out of line. Adzik says the moment that visitor produced a blank check, everything clicked into place. This wasn't trust. It was a transaction built on the assumption that a man with something to hide has no choice but to comply. Except the plan didn't unfold the way the visitor expected. Adzik did write a number on that check. A substantial one, he says, without specifying the exact figure, but he never cashed it. He held on to it instead, as physical proof that someone connected to the tournament's organizers had tried to buy the outcome of the final. That night, he says, he barely slept, staring at the check on his nightstand and turning over one question. Who did he need to warn before Sunday's kickoff? The answer was Adrian Cole. Adzik had crossed paths with him only briefly over the years, mostly handshakes before matches, but he knew he had to reach him directly, and not through any official channel that might tip off the organizers, through a mutual contact inside the team staff. He arranged a quiet, unofficial meeting at the team hotel the night before the final. Cole agreed to see him. Adzik recalls that he had no idea how to begin the conversation, because what he was about to tell one of the sport's most decorated players had never, as far as he knew, been said by a referee to a player in the history of the game. He laid it all out, the pattern of calls stretching back to the opening matches, the quiet institutional pressure, and finally, the visitor and the blank check. Cole sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Adzik expected fury, disbelief, maybe accusations. Instead, Cole just looked at the floor, absorbing it. When he finally spoke, he said something Adzik never anticipated. He'd already suspected something was wrong. Not the specifics, not the check, but for weeks he'd sensed the tournament didn't feel clean. Wins that should have felt triumphant instead left him uneasy. According to Adzik, that response confirmed everything he already believed about Cole. This wasn't a player who needed a lecture on integrity. It was baked into who he was, going back to pickup games on cracked concrete courts as a kid, long before anyone was watching or grading his performance. The two men talked for a long stretch that Adzik still won't detail fully, but by the end, Cole had made a decision. He told Adzik that very night, he was going to gather every player on the roster, all 23 of them, and tell them the truth. And then he was going to ask them to lose a final on purpose. Adzik says he stood frozen for several seconds, asking Cole if he understood what he was proposing, a decision that could never be explained publicly, that would follow every player in that room for the rest of their careers, that an entire nation of hopeful fans would never understand. Cole's answer, delivered quietly, is a line Adzik says he'll never forget. The game had given him everything he had in life, and the least he could do was protect it when it needed protecting most. Later that night, inside a closed meeting room at the team hotel, Cole gathered the squad and repeated everything Adzik had told him. The pattern of favorable calls, the check, the choice in front of them. Adzik wasn't in the room, but Cole later described the reaction to him in detail. Some players broke down immediately. Others argued furiously that they'd worked too hard to throw away a lifetime opportunity. But slowly, over hours of difficult conversation, the room came around to a shared, uneasy agreement. A trophy built on a rigged final wasn't a real trophy at all, and if the sport's governing body was as compromised, someone needed to refuse to play along, even if nobody would ever know they'd done it. Cole then explained the plan. They would take the field and appear to compete fully, sprinting, pressing, playing with visible intensity, but they would quietly fail to convert their chances, missing the kind of finishes a team of their caliber would normally make look routine. And if the match remained scoreless deep into extra time, one player would need to get deliberately sent off, leaving the team a man short and clearing a path for Castellan to finally break through. That's when Teo Basso, the tournament's breakout young midfielder, raised his hand and volunteered to take the card himself, knowing full well the public backlash that would follow, a career-defining moment reduced, in the eyes of millions, to a reckless, undisciplined mistake. Adzik says that when Cole told him what Basso had volunteered for, he had to look away from the camera during the interview to collect himself. Basso was 23, already regarded as one of the most gifted midfielders of his generation, with everything ahead of him. And in that room, he chose to accept a permanent, false narrative, reckless, careless, the player who cost his country the final, rather than let anyone else carry that weight, and rather than let the sport's corruption go unanswered. That, Adzik explains, is why Basso was in tears before the match even started. To the millions watching, it looked like nerves, the natural pressure of a young star on the biggest stage of his life. And that was partly true. But underneath it was something heavier. The quiet grief of a young man who already knew exactly what he was about to sacrifice and why. He did it because his captain asked, and because he'd idolized Adrian Cole since childhood, and trusted that if Cole believed this was the right call, it was. That single fact reframes everything the world watched that day and never understood. Cole's uncharacteristically subdued pre-match talk, usually fire and intensity, instead sounding like a captain preparing his team to lose with dignity. 90 minutes without a single shot on target from the tournament's most dangerous attacking side, a statistical anomaly that left analysts baffled afterward, with no tactical explanation that made any sense. And then, in the 93rd minute, Basso's red card, a reckless, mistimed challenge that fans tore apart online for days, never knowing it was exactly what he promised to do the night before. Down to 10 men. Castellan finally found the space they needed, and Dario Ren buried the winner in the 106th minute. Adzik, standing at the center of the pitch as it happened, says he felt two things wash over him at once. Relief that the outcome he knew was coming had finally arrived, and a deep sadness at having witnessed one of the most selfless, hidden sacrifices he'd ever seen in sport, a story the public would likely never know. But the drama didn't end with the final whistle. As Castellan's players began their celebration, several Valoria players approached them, not to fight, but to explain. They wanted their opponents to know the truth, that the result had been thrown deliberately, that Cole had gathered the team the night before, that Basso's card wasn't a mistake, but a sacrifice. Castellan's players, still riding the adrenaline of a title win, heard this and completely misread it. To them, it sounded like a bitter, desperate excuse from a team unwilling to accept defeat, an attempt to cheapen a victory they fought for with everything they had. That misunderstanding is what sparked the ugly, chaotic confrontation that broke out on the field minutes later. Not sore losers lashing out, but a raw, adrenaline-fueled reaction to an accusation. Nobody was prepared to process in the moment. Adzik admits he wanted to step in and explain everything right there, but he knew instantly that the middle of a brawl was the wrong place for that kind of truth. It would have to surface some other way. Eventually, perhaps, he says now, through this very interview, given as a retired man with nothing left to lose. He explains that for years he'd carried the weight of his old financial scandal, like a stain he couldn't remove. But this time, faced with similar test, he made the opposite choice, and in doing so, reclaimed something he says he'd lost long ago, his own sense of self-respect. He closes the interview with one final, striking admission. He knows that Adrian Cole will never be publicly remembered for what he actually did. To the world, Cole will simply be the legendary captain who came up short in his final tournament. Debated for years by pundits wondering if he should have retired sooner, if a different squad might have won, if this was really the ending his career deserved. But Cole can never correct that record, because doing so would mean exposing the governing body's corruption and implicating every player who sat in that hotel room. So he carries a false narrative in silence, having given up the ending he was chasing his entire career purely to keep one match honest. Adzik says he's telling this story now because someone finally has to. The world deserves to know that on the biggest night of the year, a referee turned down a blank check. A legendary captain chose to lose the biggest final of his life to protect the integrity of the game, and a 23-year-old midfielder volunteered to take the blame for it, fully aware that no one would ever thank him. Those three men, in his words, quietly saved something bigger than a trophy, and everyone who celebrated that final had no idea what they were actually celebrating. There's one more detail worth mentioning before the story ends. The check Adzik was handed that night still exists. He never cashed it, and he never destroyed it either. He kept it as the only physical proof of what happened behind closed doors before that final. He won't say where it's hidden now, only that it's somewhere safe, and that if the day ever comes when it matters, he knows exactly where to find it. Until then, the true story of that final remains known only to a handful of people, a quiet, unresolved thread in a sport that, in this story at least, still owes its fans a truth.